Sometimes good Christian people struggle to get along. That's just true. It's unfortunate. We don't like it, right? But it's just true. All Christians are expected to love each other, to serve one another, but sometimes we get crossways with each other. When there's at least one strong personality involved, and especially when there are two, things can go really well or really not. In the Bible, two apostles, Peter and Paul, both, we would say, I think, type A personalities, very driven guys, outspoken guys. They knock heads in Antioch when Peter's conduct is out of step with the gospel. Paul does not shy away from confronting him and calling him on it. And then there's this episode in Acts we're going to look at this morning in Acts 15, where Paul and Barnabas disagreed about something, and they disagreed so strongly that they ended up parting ways and going different directions after having traveled together, doing mission work together, preaching the gospel, planting churches. Barnabas was the one who had sort of introduced Paul to the church at Antioch and brought him there to minister there. And after they had done so much good together and traveled together and preached together and taught together, they ended up separating over a conflict they had with one another. Now, one of the reasons why I love preaching through books of the Bible, like we do right now with the book of Acts, is if we weren't preaching through Acts, there's a good chance you'd be sitting there going, who is this about? Right? Like, what conflict is he talking about? Why did he choose to preach this passage this morning? But I didn't choose to preach this passage this morning. It's not about anybody in particular. It's just where we are in our study of the book of Acts, right? So it's not aimed at anybody. It's not addressing anything in particular. But it is helpful for us to learn about this and reckon with this, because odds are you've encountered this kind of thing in your life, probably multiple times, and you probably will again. And it's helpful to have biblical categories for thinking about this kind of conflict so that we don't make it a bigger deal than it is, and also so that we try to avoid it, because that would be better, right? So Acts 15, I'm going to read for us verses 36 to 41. It's a short passage. And here's what it says. This is after the Jerusalem Council has been resolved and everything is working out great and things have gone back to normal in Antioch. And so it says in verse 36, and after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaimed the word of the Lord and see how they are. Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark. But Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Okay, so what's happening here? Well, first of all, the passage starts with a healthy desire that Paul has, right? Paul wants to go back to the churches that he and Barnabas had visited and had helped to start, right? When they brought the gospel there for the first time and they preached about Jesus and people had believed, and Paul wanted to go back to those churches to check on them. Right, to see how they were doing. Remember, Paul himself encountered some persecution, some opposition on that missionary journey. He might be wondering if the Christians there, now that he's gone, if they're the ones who are experiencing persecution, opposition. So he says, let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are. Let's go check on them. Remember, there's no cell phones, there's no email, there's no quick travel. In order to know how things are going, somebody has to go there physically and either see for themselves or bring back word of what they've seen. And so Paul wants to go see them for himself. And this is something we see in the Apostle Paul all throughout the New Testament, that he's not just a show up, preach the gospel, leave, and forget about you. Most of the letters that he's written in the New Testament are written to churches where he's been in the past, but can't be with them now, and so he wants to check on them, he wants to instruct them, he wants to encourage them. He continues to care for all of these churches. In fact, in 2 Corinthians, when he's listing all of the hardships that he's faced, the shipwrecks, the beatings, the persecution, all those things, sort of at the climax of the list, he says is his burden that he feels every day for all the churches. Right? Paul, in one sense, is not a pastor of just one church, but of many churches that he's helped to plant, that he's burdened for them, he cares about them. So, for example, he writes to the church in Thessalonica, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, he writes to them and he says, "Since we were torn away from you, brothers, for a short time, in person, not in heart, we endeavored the more eagerly and with great desire to see you face to face, because we wanted to come to you." Right? He loves these believers. He loves these churches. He wants to be with them. He thinks about them. He prays for them. And we even saw back in chapter 14 that after Paul had preached the gospel in these different towns, and one time he even got stoned and left for dead, right? He got up and went back into the town, and then he went back through the cities that he had already preached the gospel in to check on them then. So this is something Paul has already done. It's something we see throughout Paul's ministry, that he loves these churches. He cares for these churches. He wants to continue to check on their well-being. And so it's a good desire that starts this conversation. But very quickly, there arises a conflict of opinion about how they should go about this. Verse 37 says, Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark. Now, John had gone with them. John Mark had gone with them for part of their previous journey. And so Barnabas wants to take him along again. Seems reasonable, right? But Paul says, no way. Why would Paul be so adamant about not taking John Mark with them? Well, even if you've been reading Acts carefully, you probably didn't notice what happened with Mark last time, because it just gets a line or two in Acts. But the last time they traveled, back in Acts chapter 12, verse 25, it says, Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had completed their service, bringing with them John, whose other name was Mark. So they bring John, Mark along with them. And then, not long afterward, in Acts 13, verse 13, it says, Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John left them and returned to Jerusalem. So Paul's first missionary journey is mainly in Acts 13 and Acts 14. 13 verses into Acts 13, John says, never mind, I'm going home. He's out. So Paul doesn't want to bring someone along with them on this journey who didn't make it through the first one. Right? In verse 38 it says, Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. Not to put too fine a point on it, Paul's basically like, I don't want to bring a quitter. John Mark quit on us. We were barely into the work last time, and he decided to go home. Why would we bring him again? Now, we don't see or hear Paul's arguments against bringing him, aside from, I don't want to bring somebody who didn't go with us all the way last time. And we don't see how Barnabas responded, but you can imagine Paul saying, like, why would we bring someone who doesn't want to do it, who doesn't want to go the whole way? And you can hear Barnabas saying, look, everybody deserves a second chance, right? He didn't make it the whole time last time, but he wants to try again. Let's give him another chance. Remember, Barnabas, his name means son of encouragement or encourager. That's what he does. Barnabas encourages people. Paul is a real, go-getter, here's what we're going to do, and we're going to do it all the way, and I'm going to travel all over the Roman Empire until I don't have any breath left in me, And he's like, look, Mark had his chance. I don't want to bring him this time. But Paul and Barnabas are both so committed to their position that neither one of them is willing to budge. Right? Now, this is more significant than this, right? But have you ever had a conversation where you cannot agree on where to go eat or something, and you so can't agree you just end up going back home? Nobody gets what they want, right? Because nobody's willing to budge. That's what happens with Barnabas and Paul. Neither one of them is willing to say, okay, well, Barnabas, if he quits, I'm holding you accountable for that if he quits again. And Barnabas is not willing to say, okay, I get it, Paul, he quit last time, but maybe next time let's give him a chance. Neither one of them is willing to budge, so much so that these partners in ministry separate from one another. In verse 39, there arose a sharp disagreement so that they separated from each other. They go different directions, quite literally. Barnabas heads to Cyprus, which is an island. You have to get there by water. And Paul goes to Syria and Cilicia, which is on land, right? So they go different directions, different places. They split. Now, when we think about this, we need to realize that neither one of these men is necessarily wrong. Neither one of them is necessarily sinning, right? Who's sinning? Paul by saying, I don't want to take him, he quit last time? Or Barnabas by saying, I don't care that you don't want to take him, I want to take him? It's not necessarily a sin issue. They're disagreeing, they're hard-headed, they're stubborn, they're driven, but not every disagreement is a sin issue. Right now, if it is a sin issue, right, then you need to, if you're the one who's sinning, you need to repent, you need to try to resolve it, whatever. But not every disagreement is a sin issue, and not every disagreement has to be or can be immediately resolved. Sometimes it just can't, right? We would like it to be, if it can be, but sometimes it can't be. Now, Jesus says, right, if you, in Matthew 5, he says, if you are about to go offer your gift at the altar and you recognize that your brother has something against you, you need to go and be reconciled to your brother. That's dealing with a sin issue, right? But even that, sometimes you go to your brother to be reconciled and they refuse. There's only so much you can do. But this is not even that. This doesn't even rise to that level. It's not that they have something against each other. It's not that one of them has sinned against the other. They just have strong opinions in different directions, and so they've had to go different ways. And Paul says in Romans 12, verse 18, he says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Which means it's not always possible. And sometimes it doesn't depend on you. Sometimes it depends on the other person, right? But as much as you can be a part of making it right, as much as you can be a part of living peaceably with others, try to do that, right? But that doesn't mean you have to let other people decide how things are going to go all the time. It doesn't mean you have to always be the one to say, okay, we'll do it your way all the time. It doesn't mean that, because Paul didn't do that. Paul says, I'm not going with Mark. Barnabas says, I'm not going without it. Okay, well, I guess I'll see you on the other side then, because we're going different ways. Right? So we want to be at peace, we want to be unified, we want to be reconciled even, but sometimes it's just not possible. At least not in the moment. And that may not be our fault, and it may not be caused by sin. Right? Some people are really quick to assume that everything that's not just right is a sin issue. Right? Somebody must be sinning. Well, not necessarily. Sometimes we just have different personalities, different priorities, different opinions, and we just don't see things the same way. So, in this case, what happened was, the result of this conflict was a separation that seemed to last for quite a while. Barnabas does take Mark and leaves with him and goes to Cyprus. In fact, Barnabas is the one who goes in the direction of the places that he and Paul went together last time. So Barnabas is actually the one, not Paul, who goes back to check on the churches they had started on their first missionary journey, or at least that's the direction that he heads in the beginning. No doubt, Barnabas and Mark did good work, encouraged Christians, built up churches. There was a good result in that sense. Paul and Silas partnered together. Now, we haven't really heard much about Silas yet, because Silas was one of the men who came from Jerusalem to Antioch along with the letter from the Jerusalem Council to say to all the Gentile Christians, hey, you don't have to keep the law to be saved. You just have to believe in Jesus. Even though you're Gentiles, you don't have to become Jews. It's just grace. It's just faith. If you believe, you'll be saved. And that's it. We're not adding anything else to you. Right? And Silas was one of the men who had come to deliver that letter and deliver that good news. And Paul now is partnering with Silas, and he and Silas are going to go travel and preach and spread the gospel. And Paul didn't storm off because he was mad. Right? He doesn't leave the church in a bad situation or a bad frame of mind. In fact, notice verse 40. It says, Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. Now that's a different way of saying it than we would say now. What that means is they prayed for him before he left. They prayed to God to give Paul and Silas grace as they went on their journey. That's what it means when it says they were commended to the grace of the Lord. God, we're commending to you our servants, or your servants, Paul and Silas, and we ask for your grace to be upon them. That's what that means, right? So the church prayed for them. They went out. In that sense, everything's fine. Everything's good, right? Not everything, because Paul and Barnabas aren't good, right? There's still some conflict there, but it's not a bad situation all the way around. In fact, verse 41 says, he, Paul, with Silas, went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So now, instead of one missionary team, you have two missionary teams who are strengthening churches, who are preaching the gospel, who are, encouraging Christians. That's a good thing. Now, I don't know that anyone would describe the falling out between Barnabas and Paul as a good thing. Right? It clearly wasn't. But good things clearly came from it. And that's something that happens often in the Bible, right? Because God is able, even when there's sin involved, which in this case I don't think there is, but even when there is sin involved, God is able to bring out of bad things that are good. One of the classic examples is from the Old Testament, where Joseph's brothers, who hated him so much that some of them wanted to kill him, instead sold him to some traders who took him to be a slave in Egypt. That's bad, that's sinful, that's way worse than the conflict between Barnabas and Paul. But what happens? God raises Joseph up to second in command in Egypt, reveals to him through Pharaoh's dream the famine that's going to come, and through Joseph, not only stores up grain to preserve people in Egypt, but even to preserve his own family, his own brothers who hated him, and to preserve the family of Abraham. So God did something good, even though people did something bad. Good results came from it, even though what they did was wicked and sinful. The same way here, even though it's, again, much lower stakes, much less serious conflict. I don't even think this one is sinful. But out of this breakup, out of this division between Paul and Barnabas, good things come. More ministry comes. More churches are strengthened. Probably more churches are planted. But there's also a little bit more to the story. We get a couple of hints later in Paul's letters that there was some measure of resolution somewhere down the line. We even get a little bit of a clue about why this conflict maybe happened in the first place. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, this is in these verses that we usually skip over when we're reading the Bible, you know, the beginning and the end. It's just like a bunch of names about people we don't really know, and we just kind of breeze through them. Well, here's what Paul says at the end of Colossians 4:10. He says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. A couple things there, right? One, we find out, assuming that's the same Mark and the same Barnabas, which seems likely, Mark was Barnabas' cousin. Now you start to understand a little bit more why Barnabas was so adamant about taking Mark with him. Why he wasn't just like, okay, Paul, if you don't want to take him, fine. Barnabas has a stake in Mark's well-being, right? Barnabas has a stake in Mark's involvement in ministry. And it's not surprising if they're related, if they're family, that Barnabas would have stood by him, even if it meant parting from Paul. But also we see that Paul has not written Mark off. In fact, some people have probably heard about Barnabas and Paul splitting up over Mark, and so Paul has told them, look, Mark greets you, and I've given you instructions about Mark. If he comes, do not shun him. Do not turn him away because you're taking my side or something. If he comes, welcome him. Receive him. He's a brother in Christ, right? Don't be mean to him on my account like you're supporting me, right? I'm implying, right, what Paul might be trying to guard against. But what he says explicitly is, if he comes, welcome him. And not only that, in Paul's last letter, 2 Timothy, where Paul says, I've run the race, I've kept the faith, right? My time is almost over, is basically what he's saying. That's the last letter he's going to write. He knows he's going to die pretty soon. In his final instructions to Timothy, in 2 Timothy 4:11, Paul says, Luke alone is with me, right? Paul's almost by himself. Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry. Paul doesn't just say, if Mark shows up, it's fine. If Mark shows up, be nice to him. In what's probably going to be his last days or weeks or months, he says, I would like to have Mark here. I would like for Mark to come. Would you bring Mark with you? Because Mark is not only useful, but very useful for me, for ministry. Maybe that's Paul saying, maybe I was a little too harsh on Mark earlier. Maybe it's Paul saying, Mark has grown up. Mark has matured. Mark is more useful now than he used to be. Either one of those things could be the case. But in either case, Paul has not written Mark off, right? And this story that wasn't great, that Luke told us about in Acts 15, where Paul and Barnabas had this breakup over Mark. It's being healed, it seems like, toward the end of Paul's life. There is some restoration, some coming back together toward the end, and that's a good thing. So sometimes good Christian people get crossways over something. And it's not even a sin issue. Right? Sometimes that happens. Sometimes they get crossways over something that's not, neither one of them sinning, neither one of them doing anything wrong. But they get crossways with each other and they go their separate ways for a time. That's not a good thing. We don't want that to happen. We're certainly not encouraging that to happen. But it doesn't necessarily mean that one of those parties or both of those parties are clearly in the wrong. Sometimes it just happens. But what we can do when that happens, if we see that happen or we're the ones somehow involved in that happening or in the fallout of that happening, what we can do is we can pray and we can hope that in time those differences can be resolved, those divisions will be healed, so that one day, once again, those people who have served together side by side in the gospel, who've gone their own way for a time, might come back together for ministry in the end.